Have you tried to learn the modern forehand and have found some difficulty in executing some of these technical elements? Well, in today's video, I'm going to show you the most common problems with the modern forehand at the recreational level. So what you see from some professional players is a unit turn that's quite large. So some players, for example Djokovic, they will turn and the non-dominant hand will stay on the racket past the middle of the body. It will go towards the back shoulder. Now if you're a recreational player and you try to adapt this type of turn, what I've found is that most recreational players will not be able to come out of a turn that's this large, and they'll end up making contact with the ball with the dominant shoulder behind. Now the professional players use this extra big turn to their advantage. Even though they're turning this much, they still sink the stroke properly and then end up making contact with their dominant shoulder in front. But what I recommend to the recreational level players is not to allow the non-dominant hand to go past the middle of the body. So if we take this baseline as the middle of the body, do not allow your non-dominant hand to go past this point. If it does go past this point as you're turning, you might not be able to come out of this turn. So this is where you should stop. When the non-dominant hand reaches the middle of the body, this is where you separate the non-hitting hand from the hitting hand. And what will happen as a result of that, you will be able to quite easily come out of this turn and make contact with the dominant shoulder in front. Now some professional players like Nadal and Federer will straighten their arm once the racket starts to drop, and this is called a straight arm forehand. And so recreational players try to copy this, and the only problem with trying to copy a straight arm forehand is that the vast majority of tennis players worldwide plays the forehand with a bent arm. And this is true at the recreational level, at the junior level, or even at the professional level. And what happens to players that play with a bent arm forehand at contact is that no matter how hard they try to straighten the arm back here, they will go into a bend once they make contact anyway. And you have to realize that when the ball meets the strings, that part of the stroke is over in milliseconds. So players are actually not aware how they're making contact, whether they're bent at contact or straight at contact. Now they might be able to feel the straightening of the arm back here, and they might be even able to feel the straightening on the arm in the finish here. But in this area of the stroke that's happening super fast, you are not going to be able to feel whether you're completely straight or bent at the moment of contact. So whether you play your forehand with a bent arm or a straight arm, it really doesn't matter, and this part comes down to genetic predispositions. Very few players will have a straight arm from day one, so they don't think about it. They might even not be aware that they play the forehand with a straight arm, and they perform this naturally. And now most other players will play the forehand with a bent arm. This is also true because of genetic predispositions. So if you play with the forehand with a bent arm, there's absolutely no reason for you to try to straighten the arm, because what's going to happen most likely, no matter how hard you try to straighten the arm in the preparation phase, it will go back into a bend anyway. Every forehand has a wrist lag. Now this is true for forehands even with wooden rackets. So players back in those days would still have the wrist lag behind the rest of the body. Now on the modern forehand, the wrist lag is more prominent because most ATP players will close the strings as they drop the racket, and now once the wrist lag is initiated, the racket will flip into this position right here. So some players see this movement and now they try to recreate it. The big problem with this is that high-level players are not consciously executing this action. This is simply a result of the torso rotation of the body and swing acceleration. So if you are consciously trying to make a wrist lag, you're going to do what I call a fake wrist lag, and you will only be able to do so by slowing your stroke down. So what's going to happen, you're going to have to come into this position and then freeze the racket like this, and then as you go forward, you consciously have to flip the racket back. Now, if somebody tries to do a fake wrist lag, this is very easy to see, and you will see a slowing down of the stroke in this crucial phase, and it looks like that person has a hitch in their strokes. However, if you watch high-level players, you will not be able to see the wrist lag because it's inside the stroke. It's beautifully flowing in and out of that movement, and it's happening at such a speed that it looks natural. So do not try to consciously execute the wrist lag, forget about it and let it happen naturally. A wrist lag is a result of the proper rotation of the torso and stroke acceleration. So if you accelerate your stroke correctly, you will end up with a wrist lag and you will never be conscious that it's taking place. And finally, the vast majority of ATP players will have a vertical swing path at contact. So in other words, the tip of the racket will point towards the side and it will vertically go over the ball this way. And this is often interpreted as a movement of the wrist. So some recreational players will try to roll the wrist in this fashion. They will simply roll over the ball this way. And what happens if you do an isolated movement of the wrist at contact, you will only be able to do so by slowing your stroke down, and you will therefore lose power and you will also lose control. What you have to realize is that all professional players, and this includes Nadal, have a passive wrist at contact. In other words, when Nadal hits his forehand, and you can check this out in super slow motion footage, the wrist is passive in this moment. So he will hit the ball here, and then as the racket is going up, the wrist is not moving. Now it gets activated around here. When he hits this spot around the shoulder, then he starts flicking the wrist and start going like this. But at the crucial moment of contact, the wrist is passive. And the reason why the wrist is not actively rolling over the ball is because we would not be able to generate a lot of power with a small, fragile piece of the human body such as the wrist. In addition to that, if you make an isolated movement of the wrist at contact, you will also lose control. And many recreational players who do this type of flicking of the wrist start spraying the ball. They also start framing the ball. They start hitting the edges of the frame. And also what happens if you're consciously thinking about using the wrist at contact, you will start slowing the stroke down way prior to contact, and the stroke will abruptly be shortened. So it looks something like this. If I try to use my wrist, I will roll it here and the stroke will end somewhere around here. So what you have to do instead is not think about the wrist at all. Usually what happens, if you don't think of the wrist at all, the body will not allow you to hurt it. So if you think of the finish instead, you think about finishing really strong, naturally the wrist will be in place as you finish across the body like this. Now I have another video that's titled How to Perform the Kinetic Chain on the Forehand, and this video is great because it discusses the two ubiquitous technical elements on the forehand. In other words, two things that every single high-level player does. So it's crucial that you learn these two technical elements if you want to have a high-level forehand.